In the annals of medieval Europe there lingers a tale so audacious that the Church spent centuries trying to smother it into silence. For 2 years, 7 months and 4 days, it is said the Catholic world bent its knee to a woman who had taken the throne of St. Peter. Not a saint behind a veil, not a quiet advisor whispering in the ears of power, but a woman in papal robes receiving ambassadors issuing decrees guiding the Church as if she had been born to it. And yet if you turn to official chronicles you will find only a void, a silence where 3 years of papal history should be. This is the story of Papisa Juana Pope Joan, the woman who sat in the highest chair of Christendom. The Vatican long insisted she was nothing but rumour, a malicious invention whispered by Protestants or a fable spun by medieval fabulists. But for 6 centuries after her supposed reign, her story was repeated as fact even by churchmen themselves. Busts of her image adorned Siena's cathedral. Chroniclers from England to Bohemia recorded her name, and until the 15th century her place in the papal sequence was quietly acknowledged. Only later did she become an embarrassment so dangerous that Rome renumbered its popes to erase her. Why has this story refused to die? Because it strikes at the heart of authority. If the most guarded institution in medieval Europe could be deceived if the throne of Peter could be occupied by someone it swore could never qualify a woman, then the edifice of male-only power was not divine, but fragile. And fragility once seen cannot be unseen. The setting was ripe for such an upheaval. Mid-9th century Rome was no serene seat of holy wisdom. It was a city perpetually on edge, battered by external threats and internal feuds. The papacy itself, far from the timeless giant it appears in retrospect, was a contested prize fought over by aristocratic factions, foreign kings and ambitious clerics. To modern ears, we imagine the Pope as unassailable, but in 845 the papal throne was more like a chair at the head of a storm-tossed table, where alliances shifted as quickly as daggers. Pope Leo IV had just died, leaving behind no clear consensus. His passing, like that of many before him, opened the streets of Rome to plotting bribery, and sometimes outright violence. The city was not only the capital of Christendom, but also a battlefield for the great noble families, the Tusculani, the Crescentii, and others who saw in the papal crown not only holiness, but leverage. It was in this vortex that the figure of Johannes Anglicus, John the Englishman, emerged. Later generations would whisper that behind that mask was not a man at all, but a woman named Juana, born in Mainz, brilliant, relentless, and daring enough to invent a new self in order to step into a world forbidden to her sex. Whether you believe the legend or dismiss it as myth, the fact remains countless medieval voices from monks in cloisters to poets in courts accepted it as truth. And there is the first lesson of this tale: power is not only about what you are, but about what others believe you to be. Juana, according to the story, understood this with a clarity that outpaced her age. In a city distracted by rivalries, blinded by its own games of survival, she slipped through the cracks, not because no one looked, but because everyone was too busy watching each other. Imagine Rome in that moment, its streets echoing with the clatter of soldiers, its basilicas filled with incense and whispers, its noble houses plotting over wine, while the Tiber carried the refuse of the city out to sea. In such a place, the question was not whether deception was possible, but whether anyone would notice amid the chaos. The claim that a woman ruled the church is extraordinary, but so is the silence that followed. No institution erases so completely unless there is something to erase. That silence, that deliberate blank space in the record, is why this story endures. For if Joan never lived, why was she remembered so vividly, and if she did, why did she have to be forgotten so ruthlessly? This is the paradox. We begin with a woman, a throne, nearly 3 years of command. History tells us it could not have happened. Memory insists it did. Between the two lies the most dangerous space of all, the space where truth is contested, where authority trembles, and where legend becomes more enduring than fact. The year is 854. Rome seethes with uncertainty. Somewhere in this tempest, a brilliant impostor sharpens her disguise, ready to step into the vacancy left by a dead pope. She is about to attempt the greatest deception the medieval church would ever know, and the most haunting part of all, for a time she succeeds. Before we continue, if this tale keeps you company tonight, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now, softly tell me, where are you listening from, and what hour has the night brought you? In the 9th century, the city of Mainz Maguncia, in Latin, was no imperial capital, but it was alive with the pulse of empire. The Rhine carried merchants and pilgrims alike. Bishops held sway as both spiritual shepherds, and political barons and monasteries guarded the treasure that mattered most: books. For most, the city was a station along life's ordinary path. For a girl named Juana, it was a wall she was determined to climb. From the beginning, her hunger for knowledge set her apart. In an age when the highest expectation for women was obedience within the household or quiet service in a convent, Juana wanted more. She listened to priests recite homilies not with piety but with analysis. She borrowed scraps of parchment tracing letters by candlelight. She learned not only the sounds but the rhythm of Latin long before she was supposed to. In every sermon and disputation she overheard, she sensed a locked door, and she resolved to find the key. But in the world she inhabited, education was not only barred to women, it was considered dangerous for them. The notion that a woman could interpret scripture was to many as blasphemous as claiming to rewrite it. Ecclesiastical law forbade their entry into schools of theology. Knowledge itself was a masculine garment, too heavy, too sacred, so it was said for female shoulders. Juana must have seen clearly that if she walked openly toward learning, the path would end in punishment or exile. Yet something in her pride, brilliance, or simple defiance made her weigh the risk differently. The calculus began early to survive. She would need not only to learn, but to perform. Every gesture of curiosity had to be cloaked as accident, every question carefully disguised as pious wonder rather than intellectual ambition. The irony is bitter. Her education began not with books, but with deception, the first syllables of a life that would later be written in disguise. In Maguncia, she discovered both the limits of her world and the cracks in its armour. The clergy were gatekeepers, but also vulnerable. Priests who believed women unfit for knowledge still depended on them for copying weaving and domestic labour. Monasteries that barred girls from study still traded manuscripts through families in the city. Juana learned that rules were rigid in theory but porous in practice, and that perception what others thought they saw could be as powerful as truth itself. The seed of her great invention took root here. If the church said women could not be learned, then she would cease to be a woman, at least in the eyes of others. It was not enough to imitate, she would have to become. Knowledge she grasped could be both sword and shield, but only if carried in the proper costume. Picture the young Juana at a monastery gate, eyes tracing the carvings of saints and martyrs, knowing that within those walls lay texts she could never touch. The barrier was not stone but decree, and yet in that moment of exclusion the daring thought would have first crystallized: if the world refused her entry as herself, she would walk into it as someone else. Maguncia gave her the hunger and the wall to push against. The rest of her life would be the consequence of that first audacious decision, that knowledge could be seized if one dared to alter not the rules but the mask. To cross the wall between forbidden hunger and sanctioned authority, Juana needed more than courage, she needed an entirely new skin. The invention of Johannes Anglicus, John the Englishman, was no improvisation. It was a performance crafted with the precision of a spy and the patience of a saint. The first task was the body. A woman could be hidden under robes, yes, but only if every detail of movement obeyed expectation. She trained her voice to a lower register, not by crude growls, but through modulation, speaking less, speaking slower, letting gravity substitute for force. She studied the way monks carried their weight, longer strides, hands clasped behind the back, a cough muffled with the fist rather than the sleeve. These were micro-gestures, invisible unless wrong. To pass, she had to do more than copy, she had to embody. Clothing helped, but costume alone would not convince. In a society where identity was rooted in community, a stranger could not simply appear. She constructed a backstory and English origin. The choice was brilliant. Foreignness explained gaps in her past. No one in Mainz or Rome could contradict the details of her childhood. The Englishman was a traveller, a seeker of learning, from far coasts arriving without kin or record. At a time when the island kingdom was both distant and exotic, the claim made her unusual but not implausible. Documents and reputation had to follow. Juana understood that letters of recommendation were as valuable as relics. She cultivated sympathetic abbots in provincial monasteries, offering dazzling theological debate in exchange for parchment testifying to her virtue and brilliance. These letters spoke louder than any oath. Here was a monk who could parse Greek fathers and Hebrew psalms, whose piety outshone peers. The very existence of such endorsements cloaked her in legitimacy. Yet disguise is never merely external, it is psychological discipline. To live as Johannes Anglicus meant erasing reflex. She practiced restraining laughter in higher registers, masking instinctive curtsies, even altering how she crossed herself. The genius of her act lay not in flamboyance, but in restraint. She knew that parody would betray her. A monk exaggerated is a caricature. A monk precisely observed is invisible. What began as necessity soon became armour. The more flawlessly she performed her male self, the freer she became to pursue knowledge without suspicion. Her disguise was not a mask she donned at intervals, it was the skin she wore day and night. To be Juana was to risk erasure. To be John was to live, and beneath it all grew the strange truth of imposture the role shapes the actor. By constructing a man, she was not only concealing a woman, but creating a figure of authority others could believe in. The deception was never purely a trick played on others. It was an act of transformation and education in power itself. Thus Johannes Anglicus walked the cloisters a young foreign monk with no past, with a gift for languages and scripture, and with a presence so convincing that others deferred without question. Few realized that each step, each syllable was the fruit of relentless rehearsal. Juana's greatest invention was not a lie, it was a life. The monasteries of the Rhine and the provinces became Juana's first theatre of apprenticeship, the proving ground where Johannes Anglicus was tested and refined. These were not the august basilicas of Rome, but modest cloisters where discipline was looser, scrutiny lighter, and ambition often dulled by routine. It was precisely here that a phantom could learn to walk unnoticed. Juana devoured every text she could reach. While many monks stumbled through Latin with halting syllables, she read it with fluency and chased further horizons, Greek, the tongue of the early church fathers, and Hebrew, the language of the Old Testament. Few in those halls could pronounce a Hebrew psalm, let alone expound upon it. Juana could. Her brilliance was dazzling but also strategic. To hide in plain sight, she learned to let intellect speak for her, building a reputation so strong that no one thought to question what lay beneath her robes. There is an irony here. Ordinarily strangeness draws suspicion. A monk who seems different might be whispered about, tested, even expelled. But if the difference is brilliance, the community forgives it. John the Englishman was odd, yes, quiet, reserved, given to study at hours when others slept. Yet instead of condemnation, such eccentricities were explained away as the habits of a prodigy. Genius, after all, was allowed its peculiarities. Her reputation grew in corridors where boredom was common currency. When disputes arose over the writings of Augustine, or the commentaries of Origen Johannes, spoke with a clarity that silenced debate. Where others recited prayers by rote, she unpacked their meaning, weaving connections that left listeners both baffled and in awe. Some monks whispered that he had been touched by grace, others that he possessed the patience of a saint. In reality, it was neither only the relentless application of a mind that refused to be caged, yet brilliance was also her shield. Any hesitation in voice, any awkward movement could have betrayed her, but those slips were reinterpreted through the lens of her reputation. A moment of silence became contemplative genius. Averted eyes were humility, not fear. In this way, her excellence rewrote perception itself. The better she performed in the realm of the intellect, the less anyone examined her in the realm of the body. Day after day she lived this double existence. At vigils she bowed her head like the others, but while they recited psalms she rehearsed arguments in her mind. At mealtime she took the same bread, the same watered wine, but tasted only the freedom that knowledge brought. And each night in the narrow solitude of her cell she studied by flickering light, pushing herself further into the languages and philosophies that would one day serve her in Rome. Years passed in this rhythm of piety and deception. Juana emerged from the provincial monasteries no longer a novice in disguise, but a master of the role she had created. Johannes Anglicus was no longer merely a mask. It was a name whispered with respect, a scholar consulted, a monk admired. And so the phantom born from necessity gained substance. The disguise had become a destiny. Theology in Juana's age was never a cloistered pursuit. It was politics written in scripture, diplomacy disguised as doctrine. Every monastery, every bishopric, every council chamber echoed with quarrels that were less about the mysteries of God than about the reach of men. To survive in this world and to rise, Juana had to learn that faith was currency, and the true art was how to spend it. She watched closely. In debates over the Trinity, she saw that the words mattered less than the alliances behind them. A bold interpretation could win admiration, but also enmity if delivered without care. So she learned the subtler craft timing. When two rivals collided over a point of exegesis, Johannes Anglicus did not leap into the fray. He weighed, and then offered an explanation that seemed to honour both sides. His brilliance was undeniable, but his restraint was what made it safe. This was her genius, the explainer. a talent for reframing a dispute so that both factions left believing their concerns had been recognized if not resolved. One monk might storm in convinced that the Greek fathers supported his stance. Another might insist that Augustine could never be read that way. Johannes would listen gravely, then answer with layered reasoning. Yes, the Greek text did suggest this nuance, but Augustine too, if read carefully, affirmed a similar mystery. Each walked away less wounded, believing the foreign monk was an ally. In truth, he had given neither side victory, only breathing room. Silence became her other tool. In a culture that prized verbosity, her pauses carried weight. A thoughtful frown, a bowed head, a moment before speaking, these could be interpreted as gravity, as patience, as wisdom. The reality was calculation. Silence bought her time to read the room, to let tempers flare and subside, and to ensure that when she spoke, her words would land with the weight of inevitability. Even humility, that most lauded of monastic virtues, became for her less a virtue than a tactic. She rehearsed expressions of modesty, deflecting praise with downcast eyes and murmured invocations. But beneath that surface lay strategy, humility, softened envy. The more she shone, the more she needed to dim her own glow, lest resentment ignite suspicion. It was a delicate balance, dazzling enough to be indispensable, modest enough to be unthreatening. Through these lessons, Juana discovered that theology was not only a battlefield of ideas, but a rehearsal for survival. Each argument was a skirmish, each interpretation a bargain, and she cloaked in borrowed identity, maneuvered through them with a precision that would later astonish Rome. Her disguise was fragile, yes, but intellect wrapped in diplomacy became armor stronger than steel. By turning theology into a kind of chess, she ensured that every move advanced her unseen ambition, not merely to belong but to rule. By the middle of the 9th century, Rome was less the serene heart of Christendom than a city gnawed by contradictions. It was both sacred and profane centre of faith and hive of intrigue, a place where relics drew pilgrims even as armed gangs prowled the streets. To the devout, it was the earthly reflection of heaven. To the cynical, it was another battlefield in the endless war of families and factions. When Pope Leo IV died in 855, the balance shattered once again. His death did not bring solemn reflection, but frantic manoeuvring. The Tusculani, the Crescentii, the vestiges of Frankish influence all clawed for control. Each faction wanted a pope who would bless their fortunes, shield their enemies, and turn divine authority into a family inheritance. In such moments of vacuum, Rome became a city of open knives where loyalty could change overnight, and even sacred offices were auctioned at valuation by bribes, threats, or both. And yet in the very chaos lay opportunity. Factions so consumed by rivalry often sought outsiders as compromise candidates, neutral figures, whose lack of local roots made them convenient tools. This paradox would prove decisive. Where a Roman candidate brought baggage, a foreigner could be moulded, at least in theory, to serve the shifting coalitions of the Curia. It was into this tempest that Johannes Anglicus Juana's crafted persona stepped. She did not arrive unannounced, a ragged monk begging entry at the city gates. She arrived trailing reputation. Letters of recommendation from abbots along the Rhine and beyond preceded her like heralds, each bearing witness to her learning, piety, and judgment. Rome did not see a stranger. It saw a solution. Her timing was impeccable. In a city where every candidate was tainted by faction, a foreign monk with a reputation for wisdom seemed heaven-sent. The letters vouched for sanctity. Her learning promised competence. Her supposed lack of ties promised neutrality. To the cardinals weary of endless scheming, Johannes appeared less as an interloper and more as a providential compromise. But Juana knew better. She understood that in Rome, neutrality was an illusion. The city devoured innocents and remade them as players or corpses. To walk into its gates was to accept that every gesture, every word would be weighed on the scale of power. She had trained for this moment in the monasteries of the provinces where she learned silence, timing, humility as armour. Now she would need all of it. Thus she entered the capital of contradictions not as a wanderer seeking fortune, but as a carefully sharpened instrument carried forward by whispers of brilliance. In a city desperate for a pope who could calm the storm without claiming the spoils, Juana arrived not as a question but as an answer. The irony, of course, was that Rome believed it had discovered a servant, when in truth it was welcoming a master. The Roman Curia was not a single palace, but a labyrinth of antechambers, cloisters, and echoing halls where business and intrigue bled into one another. Within these corridors, Juana, still Johannes Anglicus, learned that power in Rome was not seized in grand gestures but accumulated in the quiet spaces between doors. She began, humbly enough, offering counsel to minor clerics settling disputes of scripture that would otherwise have festered into factional quarrels. A bishop from the south brought forward a challenge over the interpretation of Augustine. Johannes distilled the matter into a balanced resolution, sparing both sides humiliation. A deacon from a noble family sought advice on a sermon. Johannes crafted words that pleased both aristocrats and common pilgrims. These were not victories sung aloud, but each planted a seed of trust. Soon his reputation spread up the chain. Cardinals who had once dismissed him as an obscure foreigner began inviting him into their chambers. One valued his clarity in doctrine, another his calm in crisis, a third his knack for suggesting compromises that allowed everyone to claim dignity. In the endless chessboard of Roman politics, Johannes became the neutral piece that could move anywhere without alarming the players. And yet neutrality was only the surface. Juana understood that every favour was an investment, every counsel a future claim. When she eased the anxieties of a powerful patron, she stored credit. When she lent her wisdom to a wavering cleric, she noted his vulnerability. When she quietly helped smooth over a scandal threatening a nobleman's nephew, she collected a debt that could be cashed in later. Piece by piece, she mapped the gameboard patrons to cultivate enemies, to outflank floaters, to sway when the moment came. Small victories accumulated into something larger. An obscure abbot praised Johannes's advice to a count. Soon that count whispered his approval to a cardinal. A deacon's sermon, polished by Johannes's pen, won applause and advanced his career. In gratitude, he became a steady ally. None of these acts seemed monumental, but in Rome inevitability was built brick by brick. By the time whispers arose of who might one day wear the tiara, Johannes's name no longer sounded absurd. He was not the loudest voice nor the most powerful, but he was the one figure who had quietly solved a dozen problems, spared a dozen egos, left a dozen patrons in his debt. In the corridors of the Curia, that was the true mark of inevitability. Thus, within the antechambers of power, Juana's deception deepened into something more dangerous belief. Those who had once doubted the foreign monk now found themselves defending him, praising him, even imagining him in higher office. What began as a disguise was becoming destiny. The summer of 855 pressed heavy over Rome. The air was thick with incense and suspicion, and the streets hummed with rumour. With Pope Leo IV gone, the throne of Peter sat empty, and every faction feared what might happen if another seized it. The Tusculani whispered of installing one of their own. The rival Crescentii plotted furiously. Each camp counted votes, tallied loyalties, and imagined how their enemies would weaponize the papal crown. It was not faith that filled the city, it was dread. Into this fever stepped the cardinals gathered in solemn conclave. Behind the locked doors of their chamber, they faced a truth all of them hated to admit. If one Roman family won, the others would bleed. Each candidate tied too closely to local power carried the scent of vendetta. And so the eyes of the conclave drifted, as they so often did in moments of deadlock, toward outsiders. A neutral figure unrooted in the swamp of Roman bloodlines might be the only salvation. Johannes Anglicus Juana's carefully forged persona was just such a figure. The foreign monk carried no family banners, no militia loyalties, no debts of vengeance. His reputation for scholarship was impeccable, his piety already the subject of glowing reports. To many of the electors he seemed the perfect bandage, a holy man who could hold the throne, while they, the factions, manoeuvred behind him. But reputation alone could not secure a crown. The conclave was not a formality. Each man present carried questions sharp as knives, eager to test the mettle of candidates. And so amid the incense and candlelight, one of the senior cardinals rose with a challenge. He posed a question on the deepest of mysteries, the nature of Christ's divinity and humanity, a debate that had split councils and spawned heresies for centuries. The other candidates answered in predictable tones, citing familiar passages from Augustine, repeating orthodox formulas. Safe words, but uninspired. When Johannes's turn came, the room grew still. Juana did not rush. She let silence stretch, as if drawing wisdom from contemplation rather than rehearsed rhetoric. Then she spoke, not merely reciting, but weaving. She quoted scripture, yes, but also the Greek fathers, layering nuance upon nuance, binding contradictions into harmony. She offered an interpretation that was not only orthodox, but luminous, a reading that acknowledged the tension, and yet left both factions satisfied. It was not simply the right answer. It was an answer that felt inspired, as though grace itself had guided her tongue. The chamber shifted. Men who had come bristling with distrust found themselves nodding. Whispers ran along the benches, glances were exchanged. In that moment, the foreign monk ceased to be merely a compromise. He became a possibility. What no one in that room could have guessed was the enormity of the pressure pressing down on Juana. One slip, one hesitation, one unguarded word could have unmasked her, not only ending her ambition, but ending her life. Yet under that weight she shone brighter. Her composure was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it, an act of theatre performed before the most dangerous audience in Christendom. When the ballots were cast, the outcome was decisive, though not unanimous. Enough cardinals weary of faction and dazzled by brilliance turned their votes toward Johannes Anglicus. By consensus more than triumph, by fear more than trust, they lifted a woman onto the throne of Peter without ever suspecting it. The doors opened. Rome waited to hear the name of its new shepherd, and for the first time in history the words announced belonged to someone who was not what the world believed him to be. Juana, beneath the robes of John, had won. The coronation of Johannes Anglicus was staged with all the majesty Rome could muster. Trumpets blared, incense curled through the air, and the procession wound its way to St. Peter's as though heaven itself watched from the clouds. The faithful saw a foreign monk elevated by divine will. The cardinals saw a compromise they could manage. Only Juana knew the truth that every step, every blessing was part of a deception more daring than any miracle Rome had ever claimed. She played the role flawlessly. Draped in papal vestments, crowned with the tiara, she lifted her hand in benediction, her voice calm and resonant, her demeanour humble, yet assured. The crowd saw sanctity, the clergy saw prudence. Juana saw the razor's edge on which she now balanced. One misstep, one careless moment, and the papacy would collapse into scandal. From the first day of her reign, she rewrote the choreography of access. Audiences with the Pope, once casual, became carefully structured. Visitors were received in groups rather than a lone conversation managed, so that she was never caught unguarded. Private chambers were guarded not only by clerics but by ritual itself. Meetings shortened, procedures formalized, excuses offered for avoiding sudden interruptions. Ceremonies too were subtly adjusted. Where tradition demanded lengthy, close-contact blessings, Juana introduced more distant gestures, explained as humility or a return to apostolic simplicity. She limited physical proximity, reducing the chances of accidental discovery. Even the papal liturgy was quietly edited gestures, minimized movements slowed, all cloaked in the language of reverence. Behind this velvet performance lay an iron ritual of control. Each morning began with rehearsed routines: how to robe quickly, how to hide contours beneath layers of fabric, how to command presence without inviting intimacy. Meals were scheduled with precision, attendants chosen for their discretion. Illness was feigned when necessary, travel restricted to avoid circumstances she could not choreograph. And yet the disguise was not only defence, and it became identity. The longer she lived as pontiff, the more Johannes Anglicus solidified in the minds of others. The cardinals forgot their doubts. Envoys spoke of his wisdom with admiration. Commoners cheered the foreign pope who seemed to balance justice with mercy. The role ceased to be performance and became reality, not because the truth had changed, but because belief itself is power. But Juana never forgot the danger. Each day was a balancing act, each gesture a matter of survival. Coronation had not ended her deception, it had only raised the stakes. Now the mask was not merely for entrance into knowledge, but for command over Christendom. Thus began the double life, Pope John to the world, Juana to herself. A woman on the throne of Peter, hidden in plain sight, ruling with the calm precision of someone who knew that discovery meant death. And still she did not flinch. Each dawn in the Lateran palace began with the same ritual calculation: how much of today could be trusted to routine, and how much must be controlled to the last breath. For Johannes Anglicus Juana in disguise, the papacy was not only the burden of Christendom, but the constant shadow of discovery. To govern meant to survive, and to survive meant turning every action into camouflage. Fear was never absent. The question hovered over every meeting: did anyone suspect a cough too high in pitch, a gesture too delicate, a robe that slipped wrong and he could ignite ruin? Yet that same fear sharpened her into extraordinary focus. Where others coasted on the inertia of office, Juana approached each day as if it were a test, each decision weighed for its political and personal risk. Administrative competence became her shield. The Curia expected a foreign pope to flounder, to be pliant in their hands. Instead, she displayed a grasp of governance that disarmed critics. She tightened record-keeping, insisted on clarity in correspondence, and dispatched envoys who returned with glowing reports of papal prudence. Every efficient decision, every fair judgment reassured allies that their gamble on an outsider had been wise. Her brilliance was not only tolerated, it became essential to Rome's stability. Yet beneath the iron mask of self-preservation lay conscience. Juana had lived the vulnerabilities of those society ignored, and she did not forget. Quietly, she championed reforms that seemed minor but rippled outward. She ordered better instruction for young clerics, insisting that education must go beyond rote memorization to genuine understanding. She encouraged the preservation and copying of texts, expanding access to learning for those beyond elite circles. Even more striking were her decrees aimed at the fragile widows, orphans, the poor. She mandated protections for inheritances easily stolen by opportunistic relatives. She directed alms more systematically to families at risk of collapse. In an age when the Church often sided reflexively with noble interests, these reforms felt radical. And yet they were small enough, framed in the language of Christian duty, to pass without alarm. Was this conscience or strategy? Likely both. To extend mercy was to affirm her own humanity, pressed daily into silence by disguise. But each act of justice also reinforced her image as a pope of rare holiness, building a reputation that insulated her from suspicion. Compassion doubled as camouflage. Thus the reign of Johannes Anglicus unfolded a pontificate balanced on a sword's edge, where fear and faith, deception and reform intertwined. The mask of John hid a woman's face, but also magnified her capacity to govern. And while she lived every hour aware that unmasking meant death, she also ensured that her time on the throne would leave a mark no erasure could fully destroy. Every deception, however daring, survives only as long as its audience accepts the performance. Juana, wearing the face of Johannes Anglicus, understood this better than anyone. The secret of her life was fragile, but her brilliance gave it room to breathe. Excellence in Rome became not only virtue, but survival. Foreign envoys were among the first to spread her legend. Ambassadors from Francia, Lombardy, and the distant courts of the north arrived, expecting to find another compromised pontiff, pliant, distracted, pulled apart by Roman factions. Instead, they reported home of a pope who listened intently, weighed disputes with fairness, and replied with unexpected clarity. Letters carried back across the Alps praised his prudence, his learning, even his humility. For monarchs weary of papal chaos, Johannes seemed a rare gift, steady, judicious, incorruptible. These reports built a shield stronger than any wall. The cardinals who might have doubted found themselves constrained. To question Johannes was to question the judgment of foreign rulers who now lauded him. Even those who disliked his reforms grudgingly admitted their effectiveness. It was difficult to plot against a pope whose reputation abroad bolstered Rome's standing. Brilliance also disarmed rivals at home. When opponents sought to trap him in theological error, Johannes answered with such precision that their own arguments appeared clumsy. When nobles pressed for favours, he devised compromises that gave them enough to save face without surrendering principle. Each time he emerged unscathed, suspicion weakened. After all, could such wisdom truly be the mask of an impostor? And yet the ecology of secrecy remained delicate. Juana knew that her intellect could not silence every doubt. A raised eyebrow here, a lingering glance there. Rome was full of men who thrived on whispers. She lived each day aware that the more she excelled, the more she attracted attention. Excellence bought time, but it also invited scrutiny. The paradox was cruel. To be average was to risk exposure. Mediocrity would have made her dispensable, and dispensable men are easily unmasked. To be exceptional was to shield herself behind awe, yet awe could breed envy, and envy could sharpen eyes that looked too closely. Thus her papacy walked the edge of a blade. Every triumph strengthened her disguise, but also tightened the pressure. One slip could collapse the entire edifice. Juana lived not as a ruler enthroned in majesty, but as a woman, balancing on the razor's edge of her own brilliance, keeping her secret alive by the sheer weight of her competence. For nearly 2 years, Juana had ruled by discipline alone, her every hour, a performance, her every gesture rehearsed to perfection. Yet no mask, however skillful, can be worn forever without strain. Beneath the tiara and the robes, beneath the iron routines that kept her secret safe, lived a woman who longed not for power, not even for freedom, but for someone to see her as she truly was. That yearning arrived in the form of a man named Floro. Floro Florus in the Latinized documents was a cleric of sharp mind and gentle bearing recently arrived from Francia. His reputation as a translator and copyist was solid, but it was his discretion that won him entry into the papal household. He spoke little, observed much, and possessed a loyalty that made him invaluable. For Juana, surrounded by courtiers who measured every kindness for advantage, this quiet man became an oasis. At first he was simply useful, a secretary who could be trusted with delicate correspondence, a scholar who could keep pace with her in debates over scripture. But slowly as the weeks became months, she began to allow him closer, not with reckless confession, but with hints, fragments, tests, a phrase let slip though it carried a double meaning, a pause in conversation longer than protocol allowed, a touch of vulnerability where before there had only been marble composure. Floro noticed. Perhaps he did not understand at once, but he felt the current shifting. The Pope who had seemed untouchable began to reveal slivers of humanity, and with them a gravity that pulled him in. Step by step, Juana allowed him to glimpse what no one else could, not Johannes Anglicus the monk pope, but Juana the woman who had built the illusion. This slow unveiling was not merely the indulgence of love, it was strategy of the most dangerous kind. By binding Floro with intimacy, she bound him to her fate. Love in this context became complicity, and complicity became loyalty more unshakable than oath. He could betray her, yes, but to do so would be to betray his own heart. And so the risk transformed into protection. The more he loved her, the safer her secret became. But there was more. Love sharpened her statecraft. The nights spent speaking in whispers, confiding truths she had never voiced, gave her a new clarity. The solitude of deception had been a heavy burden. Now with a witness, her resolve hardened. To be seen was to be affirmed, and affirmation gave her strength to govern more boldly. Why even perfect self-command yearns for witness is a mystery as old as humanity. Perhaps because deception, however necessary, is lonely. Perhaps because power, however absolute, is cold when unshared. For Juana, Floro became proof that beneath the costume she was still alive, still herself, still capable of love. Yet with every stolen glance, every hushed conversation, the danger grew. The secret that had carried her to the summit of Christendom now carried within it a heartbeat, her own quickened, and another's dangerously close. What had been a solitary deception was now a duet, and duets are harder to silence. By the winter of 1856, the body that had carried Juana through every disguise began to betray her. For years she had mastered the smallest details, voice, step gesture, but now came a challenge no training could silence. At first it was subtle morning nausea, dismissed as indigestion fatigue, blamed on the endless burdens of the papacy. When her temper flared, she excused it as stress. When her robes grew tighter, she claimed the feasting season had left its mark. Yet the rhythm of change was inexorable. Month by month, her body altered in ways no cover story could sustain. A pope could be stern, even eccentric, but not visibly pregnant. Whispers, once absent, began to hover at the edges of court. Attendants wondered why the Holy Father so often withdrew in the mornings, why he walked with greater caution, why meals were taken in smaller portions. Juana understood the timeline problem. She might conceal a month, 2, perhaps 3, but nature allowed no indefinite delay. By Easter, the truth would be impossible to hide. And so for the first time since assuming the tiara, she planned not an advance but a retreat. The scheme was ingenious in its simplicity. After the Paschal season, Johannes Anglicus would declare grave illness and withdraw temporarily from public ceremonies. A trusted physician, already bribed and sworn to secrecy, would furnish documents attesting to a wasting sickness that demanded seclusion. Withdrawing from Rome under pretense of treatment, Juana could vanish during the most critical months, returning later with a narrative of miraculous recovery. The plan had elegance, even plausibility. Medieval Europe was no stranger to sudden illness or to long papal absences. Precedent could cover her tracks. Yet beneath the confidence lurked dread. Too many variables, the loyalty of a single doctor, the scrutiny of ambitious cardinals, the risk of timing a disappearance in the middle of a turbulent city, and most cruelly the child itself. No schedule of secrecy could dictate when birth would come, so Juana continued her days in calculated calm. She presided over councils, issued decrees, blessed pilgrims, all while counting weeks with cold precision. To the world she remained Pope John's steady shepherd of Christendom. To herself she was a woman racing against a clock written in flesh. It was the greatest irony of her reign. For 2 years she had outwitted Rome with intellect and cunning. But now, at the pinnacle of her triumph, the enemy that threatened to undo her was not conspiracy or betrayal, but biology itself. 25th April 857 dawned with the pageantry of tradition. The feast of St. Mark demanded spectacle and Rome delivered. The Via Papalis, that ceremonial artery threading through the city, was hung with banners, thronged with citizens, lined with windows spilling incense smoke and eager eyes. It was a stage prepared for majesty. At its centre walked the Vicar of Christ, Johannes Anglicus, his robes heavy with embroidery, his tiara gleaming in the sun, but beneath the vestments Juana's body was no longer obedient. For months she had hidden its secret with artful layers and cautious choreography. This morning, however, concealment gave way to betrayal. As the procession wound from San Clemente towards San Giovanni in Laterano, she felt the first contraction, sharp, undeniable, a knife of truth, cutting through the illusion. She steadied her pace, forcing her breath to remain even, her face composed into the mask of blessing. A hand lifted a sign of the cross traced in the air as though nothing had changed. Yet within her mind the calculation raced distance to sanctuary, likelihood of a retreat, the eyes of thousands fixed upon her. To stumble, to pause, to vanish into a side street would be to invite suspicion. To continue, it was to gamble against nature itself. The math was brutal. The route stretched long, the crowd pressed close, the clergy surrounded her with ceremonial rigidity. There was no discreet exit. Every step was performance, and every step brought the contractions harder, closer, more insistent. For years she had triumphed through will, through self-command, through the cold discipline that made deception seem divine. But now will met its limit. The body, indifferent to crowns and councils, demanded its due. She pressed forward, her face the image of serenity, even as sweat dampened her brow and her grip tightened on the staff of office. Then the moment came when no strength could suffice. The mask faltered. A cry, half gasp, half groan, escaped her lips, echoing down the sacred street. The crowd stirred. Cardinals glanced in alarm. What had seemed majesty only moments before twisted suddenly into fragility. Juana fought for composure, but nature was relentless. The contractions bore down, and the body that had carried her so far announced itself to the world. Will yielded to biology, and the Via Papalis intended, as the stage of papal triumph became instead the stage of revelation. The moment cracked like thunder. One instant the procession moved with solemn rhythm, banners, fluttering chants rising. The next the Pope staggered, robes twisting as a cry tore from his lips, not the chant of blessing, but the raw sound of pain. Gasps rippled down the Via Papalis. The papal staff, slipped attendants, rushed forward, and before the bewildered eyes of thousands, Johannes Anglicus crumpled onto the cobbles. At first, confusion reigned. Some thought the Holy Father struck by seizure or poisoned by rivals. Cardinals bent close, searching his face, his pulse. Then came the truth, impossible to mistake the rhythmic convulsions of labour. And moments later, in the stunned silence of the street, another cry rose, the thin wail of a newborn child. Rome froze. The cardinals who had mastered every intrigue, who had spun doctrine to their advantage, stood dumb as statues. Nobles in their balconies clutched railings, peasants in the crowd crossed themselves in horror. A pope in full regalia lay on the street of procession, cradling an infant. Meaning itself buckled. Some believed they witnessed a miracle, a sign from heaven. Others muttered of sorcery, of Antichrist, of apocalypse. For most the shock was too great for words. What they saw rewrote the world in a single breath. Their shepherd, their pontiff, was a woman. And yet in that moment of catastrophe, Juana did not beg. She did not weep or deny. According to the accounts that survived, her first words after the birth were steady, almost defiant. I have served God and his church with the same devotion as any man before me. Not apology but claim, not shame but testament. The crowd, torn between awe and outrage, could not answer. Cardinals, paralysed, exchanged glances heavy with terror, not simply at her deception but at their own complicity. For nearly 3 years they had obeyed her, kissed her ring, treated her blessings as holy writ. Now all of it lay exposed as the orders of a woman they had been trained to believe unfit even to read scripture aloud. The Via Papalis, once the avenue of triumph, had become the stage of revelation, and the cry of a newborn, small, insistent, undeniable, had silenced Rome. The hours after the procession were not filled with righteous fury, as one might expect, but with a deeper, more corrosive emotion, fear. The cardinals who had watched Juana collapse, who had heard the unmistakable cry of her child, did not at first thunder about sin or heresy. They whispered instead of exposure. For if a woman could ascend the throne of Peter and govern undetected for nearly 3 years, then what was the papacy but a costume vulnerable to disguise? Theirs was a fear of contagion. News spreads faster than decrees, and by sunset Rome already buzzed with stories. Some claimed it was a miracle, others a monstrous omen. What united them was awe the papal office had been breached, its supposed sanctity pierced. The hierarchy recognized the danger instantly. If the people began to believe that the office could be fooled, then the office itself might unravel. So that night, in chambers lit by oil lamps and heavy with incense, the College of Cardinals convened an emergency session. No one questioned what had happened. Too many had seen it. The question was what to do now. The tone was cold, not pastoral, but surgical. They spoke not of mercy, but of containment. Swiftly the verdict formed. Juana must be excised like rot from wood. Her reign erased, her name struck from record, her life ended before the scandal spread further. Punishment was not framed as justice, but as necessity. To preserve the illusion of papal infallibility, the example had to be obliterated. The cardinals cloaked their decision in doctrine, calling it protection of the faithful defence of the Church's purity. But beneath the words lay naked calculation. If Joanna lived, she was proof that authority was permeable, that their fortress of male sanctity was little more than ritual and costume. That could not be allowed to stand. And so the hierarchy acted with brutal efficiency. At dawn, the woman who had been Pope John, who had governed with prudence and even compassion, was condemned without trial. The order was unanimous, the logic merciless. The wound had to be cauterized. The irony was bitter. The men who had once praised her wisdom, who had relied on her brilliance to steer their fractious church, now conspired to erase her, as though she had never been. Their first instinct was not to defend faith, but to defend themselves from the truth she embodied. At dawn, the sentence was carried out with the precision of men desperate to make an example vanish. There were no public trials, no long confession staged for the faithful, only silence, a swift execution, and the hurried disposal of a body that had until hours earlier been clad in the garments of St. Peter. The woman once hailed as Pope John was gone, struck down not for her errors of governance, but for her truth of being. But the axe, though final, created a problem sharper than any blade. How do you erase a Pope? Joanna had not merely worn the tiara. She had governed. She had signed bulls and decrees sealed with papal authority. She had received ambassadors whose reports were now archived in distant courts. She had changed procedures in the Lateran reallocated funds and established protections for widows and orphans. These were not whispers easily silenced. They were facts inscribed in ink, decisions already rippling outward into the life of Christendom. The first attempt at erasure was crude. The hierarchy simply declared that Pope John had never existed. The official record skipped years as if history itself had dozed. But this only created more suspicion. Clerks who had copied papal letters still held drafts. Envoys who had dined with the pontiff wrote home of their meetings. Bishops who had received instructions could not pretend otherwise. To erase Juana was to erase the paper trail of half a continent. And so the cover story faltered almost immediately. Too many witnesses remembered audiences' blessings, judgments. Too many parchments bore her hand, to insist that those years were a phantom-strained belief more than the truth itself. The silence in the record became a louder proclamation than any admission. Rome found itself trapped in its own paradox. It could kill the woman, but it could not kill the memory of her reign. Every attempt to blot her out only made the absence more visible. And in that absence, rumour took root with renewed vigour. Whispers spread through cloisters and markets alike. There had been a woman on the throne of Peter, and the Church's denial was proof enough. Thus, after the axe fell, the real battle began not against Juana herself, but against what she represented. The papacy could control parchment and pronouncement, but memory once stirred had a life of its own, and memory, unlike a body, cannot be executed at dawn. When the first cover story collapsed under the weight of documents and witnesses, the hierarchy adjusted its strategy. Instead of denying the pontificate outright, they conceded that a Pope John had indeed reigned, but a man nothing more. According to this revised tale, he had governed briefly piously and died of natural causes, his memory honourable, his record unblemished. The cries on the Via Papalis, the newborn in the street, the stunned silence of thousands, these were dismissed as hallucination rumour, or the hysteria of a credulous crowd. This second version carried a certain bureaucratic neatness. It allowed the papal sequence to continue with fewer gaps, the parchment registers to retain continuity, and the cardinals to preserve their dignity. To the official record, the incident was tidied into oblivion. A man had ruled, a man had died. End of story. But the people of Rome had seen otherwise. Markets and taverns buzzed with recollection. "I was there, I saw the Holy Father cry out like a woman in travail." Pilgrims carried the tale north and east, embellishing it, polishing it into legend. Within a generation, the story of the woman pope had crossed mountains, whispered in monasteries of Germany, sung in ballads in France, recorded in chronicles from Bohemia to England. The more the church suppressed, the more irresistible the story became. Erasure bred fascination. Every denial from the pulpit only convinced listeners that something had been hidden. Juana's name became a quiet syllabus in possibility. If a woman could deceive the very guardians of orthodoxy, then what else was possible? If a woman could rule more wisely than many men, why should she not, Europe hungry for stories of marvels and betrayals, embrace the tale? To some, Joan was a cautionary figure, proof of sin and deception. To others, especially among the marginalised, she became a symbol of subversion. An example that the structures of power were not impregnable. In cloisters and kitchens alike, mothers told daughters that once long ago, a woman had worn the tiara of Peter. The church tried to unremember her with ink and silence. But memory lives in mouths, not only in manuscripts. The paradox was cruel and inevitable. The harder Rome insisted she had not existed, the more vividly she came alive in the imagination of Europe. Erasure works best is when no fragments remain. But Juana's story left behind splinters, pieces of evidence that refused to obey the command to vanish. They were not whispers this time, but objects, practices, and records too stubborn to dissolve into myth. The first is written into stone and parchment alike, the Vicus Papissa, the Street of the Papus. Medieval maps of Rome from the 10th century onward mark it clearly. It ran between San Clemente and San Giovanni in Laterano, the very stretch where, according to every chronicle, the Pope collapsed in childbirth. Was the name coincidence? The odds seem too sharp. Streets rarely acquire titles from thin air. They are christened by memory, by events the city refuses to forget. Even after the Vatican proclaimed Joan a fiction, the map of Rome itself continued to bear her trace. Then there is the sedia perforata, the pierced chair. From the 11th century forward, candidates for the papacy were required to undergo a ritual both solemn and humiliating. Seated on a marble throne with a hole carved in the seat, the new pope was examined to confirm what Joan had disproved, that he possessed testicles. Only then did the officiant pronounce the formula, "Testiculos habet etna pendentes," he has testicles and they hang well. Centuries of ritual do not spring from nowhere. The existence of this practice suggests an anxiety so profound that it needed ceremony to smother it. The church would later claim the rite was symbolic, but its timing emerging after Joan betrays its origin. Even more telling are the dates. Chroniclers across Europe writing in different centuries repeat the same duration for her reign, 2 years, 7 months, 4 days. They agree on the same death in 857, on the same Via Papalis collapse. Consistency is not proof, but it is pattern, and patterns rarely survive centuries of retelling, unless anchored by something weightier than rumour. And finally, the most damning fragments, the administrative acts themselves. Papal bulls from the mid-850s still exist in the Vatican archives, carrying the seal of a Pope John, who according to modern numbering never reigned. These documents issue orders on clerical education, on inheritance rights, on alms for widows, precisely the reforms chroniclers attribute to Joan. The Vatican's solution was simple: renumber. The popes fold the gap into silence and hope no one noticed. But the bulls endure. Ink, unlike memory, does not blush. These fragments, street names, marble chairs, dates, documents refuse to align with official erasure. They stand like stones in a stream, disrupting the smooth current of denial. Each on its own might be explained away. Together they whisper stubbornly something happened, something the church could not fully bury. The simplest way to hide a body is not to bury it, but to rearrange the furniture around the absence. That is precisely what Rome attempted with the papal succession. After Juana's reign, the College of Cardinals quietly adjusted the numbering of popes named John. What should have been John the VIII became John the VIII, and later Johns shifted forward in the count. The shuffle was executed with bureaucratic calm, as if arithmetic itself could erase memory. But the gap lingered like a skipped heartbeat. Anyone studying the sequence closely could see the space where something or someone had been. For centuries the adjustment passed as unremarkable. Few had the leisure to compare manuscripts or tally lists across kingdoms. But when Renaissance scholars began to comb through old records with humanist zeal, the neat cover unravelled. They discovered Byzantine chronicles that spoke matter-of-factly of a woman pope noting her collapse on the Via Papalis. Arabic historians trading tales through merchants and pilgrims also recorded a woman who deceived the Latins. Carolingian annals, written from courts with no interest in Rome's myth-making, casually referenced a Pope John whose dates aligned perfectly with Joan's supposed reign. These were not Protestant polemicists with an axe to grind, nor medieval fabulists spinning legends by the hearth. They were distant observers with no stake in Rome's embarrassment, repeating a story as if it was simply fact. And therein lies the sting, when cultures with no reason to conspire agree on details that Rome insists never happened. Silence becomes suspicious. The Renaissance rediscoveries gave the legend fresh breath. Scholars who prided themselves on skepticism found themselves puzzled by the consistency. How could so many independent witnesses scattered across centuries and cultures agree on the same scandal with the same dates, if nothing at all had occurred? Some tried to explain it as rumour crystallized into certainty. Others whispered more boldly perhaps the Vatican had indeed tried to renumber the past, but parchment in Constantinople and Baghdad had refused to play along. Rome, of course, doubled down. Official pronouncements insisted Joan was a fabrication, a medieval morality tale mistaken for history, but the more insistently they denied, the more voraciously scholars hunted for traces, and each rediscovery, be it a Byzantine marginal note, an Arabic traveller's report, or a Carolingian clerk's entry, became another voice in a chorus that refused to be silenced. The papal number shuffle might have fooled the faithful, but it could not erase the wider memory of Europe. History, like arithmetic, resists manipulation. And when the sums do not add up, people start to ask what was taken away. By the 16th century, the legend of Pope Joan had become more than a curiosity, it was ammunition. The Protestant Reformation tore through Europe and reformers grasped eagerly at any story that undermined the sanctity of Rome. Luther, Calvin and their followers invoked Joan as proof that the papacy was fallible, even laughably so. See, they argued the throne of Peter can be fooled. Its guardians deceived, its solemn rites turned into farce. To Protestants, Joan was not just a woman in disguise, she was a weapon, a living parable of corruption and vulnerability at the heart of Catholic power. Faced with this assault, Rome did not soften. It doubled down. What had once been a half-suppressed embarrassment now became an official non-existence. Papal historians rewrote the records with surgical precision, insisting Joan was no more than a tale invented by heretics, a medieval fable misread by gullible chroniclers. The harder Protestants wielded her as a bludgeon, the harder the Vatican worked to deny that she had ever lived. By the 17th century, Rome had established its official line. Joan was myth full stop, but myths have power precisely because they are contested. In the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers rediscovered Joan with fresh fascination. Voltaire, Diderot and other philosophers seized upon her as a symbol not of papal corruption, but of human possibility. To them, her story illustrated the absurdity of gendered exclusions and the fragility of institutions that claim divine permanence. If a woman could govern the church better than many men, then perhaps the structures that barred her sex from power were nothing more than superstition clothed in ritual. In the 19th century, as women began pressing more forcefully for education, suffrage, and public voice, Joan became theirs. Early feminists embraced her not as a saint or sinner, but as proof that history had always contained women capable of ruling. Pamphlets celebrated her as a precursor to emancipation, a reminder that brilliance and courage could not be confined by sex. Where Rome saw scandal, activists saw inspiration. Thus, Joan's memory became less an archive than a battleground. Protestants, Catholics, Enlightenment skeptics and feminists all claimed her, reshaping her image to serve their own cause. Each retelling bent the story, but none erased it. She survived precisely because she was useful, because her legend pressed on the sorest points of authority, gender and power. The Vatican could erase her from registers, but it could not stop Europe from arguing over her. Joan had become more than a figure of the past. She was a mirror in which each age glimpsed its anxieties and its hopes. Two doors open from the tale of Joan, and whichever one you choose, you step into the same room. If she lived, if Juana truly wore the tiara and governed the church, then she proved by deed what the world swore was impossible, that a woman could sit on the throne of Peter and not merely survive, but excel. The papacy did not collapse under her. Councils did not splinter. Christendom did not crumble. For nearly 3 years, the institution functioned arguably better than under many of her male predecessors. Her existence, if real, is the most devastating rebuttal to centuries of exclusion. And if she did not live, if Joan is only legend, then what does it mean that generations believed she had, that monks, chroniclers, poets, and pilgrims across Europe told her story as if it were true? It means that even in the heart of a patriarchal age, people admitted, if only in whispers, that it was thinkable. They found it plausible that a woman could outwit men, master theology, and rule the church. Myth in this case is no less radical than fact, for it exposes the cracks in cultural certainty. Either door leads to the same conclusion: gender is not essence, but gatekeeping. The barrier that excluded women from power was never ability, it was decree, costume, ritual. Joan's story, truth or fable, lays bare that these walls were built not of nature but of fear. For modern audiences, this is the psychological payload. We live still with barriers dressed as inevitabilities, glass ceilings explained as competence gaps, exclusions justified as tradition. Joan whispers across the centuries that such walls are flimsy. If she existed, she shattered them. If she didn't, the very willingness of her culture to imagine her shows that the walls were never natural. Thus the legend stings in any age. It tells us that power often rests not on truth but on perception, and that perception can be rewritten. The papacy survived Joan, real or imagined, but the idea she embodied that the most rigid exclusions are fragile fictions has never died. History leaves us in the uneasy space between proof and plausibility. Did Juana exist in flesh and blood as Johannes Anglicus ruling Christendom from the Lateran for 2 years, 7 months and 4 days? Or is she a story woven from rumour, sharpened into parable, then carried forward by centuries hungry for scandal and symbol? The archive offers fragments, maps with a paper street bulls signed by a missing John, a marble chair with a hole in its seat, but never the certainty of a smoking gun. Yet even without verdict, consequences remain. Whether a woman in disguise or a myth grown so large it shaped ritual. Joan altered the imagination of Europe. She forced the church to adjust its numbering, to invent humiliating tests for future popes to close ranks against memory. She armed Protestants with satire philosophe, with critique feminists with precedent. She lived, if not in body, then in the cultural bloodstream of the West. What then do we do with such a tale? The task is not to polish it into certainty, nor to discard it as fabrication, but to honour its work in the world. Quiet historians, those who resist the roar of dogma, treat legend and document alike as evidence, not of what happened, but of what mattered. Joan matters because she exposes how power is performed, how rules are costumes that can be worn and unworn, how institutions are stories told with straight faces until someone dares to laugh. The lesson is not simply that a woman might once have ruled the church. It is that dignity often survives in the very act of remembering precisely. To recall her whether as fact or fable is to resist the erasures that authority demands. To say her name is to admit that even the most rigid systems are permeable, that even the grandest myths of permanence can be cracked by a single life or by the memory of one. And so the cadence falls quiet, not with certainty but with clarity. Joan, real or imagined, reminds us that possibility itself is a form of rebellion. Rules are real, institutions are stories, and the stories we choose to keep alive are themselves acts of power. The story of Pope Joan, whether a tale of daring reality or a legend hardened by centuries of repetition, resonates not because of certainty, but because of what it reveals about human possibility. In the 9th century, when women were barred from classrooms, pulpits, and positions of authority, Joan, or the idea of her, stood as proof that exclusion was never about capacity. It was about costume, decree, and fear. That is why her story still matters, and why it offers us lessons far beyond the walls of Rome. The first lesson is simple, but unsettling power is often a performance. Institutions rest not only on law or faith, but on perception. Joan's disguise worked because others wanted to believe in her authority. They needed a figure who could resolve disputes and steady Rome. Her competence gave them what they craved, and they accepted the performance without question. In our own age, where appearances, branding, and curated images shape so much of leadership, her story reminds us to ask, do we trust substance, or are we too easily persuaded by the costume? The second lesson is about the fragility of rules. For centuries, the Church declared women incapable of governance, insisting their role was silence. And yet, according to legend, when a woman sat in the highest office, the Church continued to function. This suggests that many barriers we treat as natural are in fact invented. Today, whether in workplaces, communities, or politics, we encounter ceilings justified as tradition. Joan's tale teaches us to see them as temporary scaffolding waiting to be dismantled. A third lesson lies in the paradox of erasure. The Vatican tried to silence Joan first by denying her existence, then by rewriting records, then by ridiculing the story. But the harder it pressed, the more enduring the memory became. Erasure backfired into legend. From this we learn that truth, or even the suspicion of truth, has its own stubborn gravity. Attempts to bury uncomfortable realities often give them more life. In our personal lives too, the lessons we try hardest to forget are the ones that insist on returning until we face them directly. Perhaps the deepest lesson is about dignity. If Joan truly spoke after her collapse on the Via Papalis, "I have served God and his church with the same devotion as any man before me," then her words echo across centuries as testimony. They remind us that worth is not bound to gender, class, or circumstance. Dignity is claimed in the act of standing, sometimes in disguise, sometimes in truth, and declaring one's service, one's capacity, one's humanity. Whether Joan lived or not is less important than the reality her story continues to reveal, that the walls we treat as eternal are often paper-thin, and that courage can pierce them. Her life or her legend asks us to question which rules in our own world are costumes, which institutions are stories, and what possibilities might open if we dare to challenge them. In the end, Pope Joan's greatest gift is not certainty but permission. The permission to see limits as inventions and to remember that what once seemed unthinkable may simply be waiting for someone bold enough to attempt it. Thank you for sharing this quiet moment with me. Subscribe so the next stories can find their way to you as well.